Lennington is joining me this morning. Good morning, Dan. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I was sharing with you, and I'll say this on air too, because I genuinely mean it. I'm so grateful for your organization, for Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, and for what you do to preserve our freedoms and defend our liberties. And it's so comforting to know that your team continues to grow. And I'm obviously grateful for your founder Rick Essenberg and then all that many of the attorneys with your organization are working on. I'm sure round the clock. Well, maybe not round the clock, but just about. And I'm grateful for all of it. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome. We love to work on these sort of issues, and working for liberty is a fun thing to do. It's not something that everybody gets to do in their everyday life, but it certainly is very rewarding, and we meet all sorts of people, hear all sorts of stories, and it's amazing. In our society, we hear more and more people who are being victimized by their race. And it's happening everywhere. It's happening in schools, it's happening at businesses, it's happening in the government. And we're just really grateful that the U.S. Supreme Court has issued a decision just clarifying that everyone is created equal and everyone has equal rights and deserves equal rights.
Well, and you started a equality for all agenda following this decision. Let's talk a little bit about what it entails.
Yeah, so the decision came out a couple weeks ago, and the headline is it struck down affirmative action at Harvard and North Carolina, meaning that universities are no longer able to use race as a factor when they decide whether to admit someone to college or a university. But the decision goes much farther than that. The decision says that the Constitution and federal law, which applies to private entities like Harvard, for example, is a private college. Federal law and the Constitution demands the absolute equality of all citizens, in that governments, schools, businesses cannot get away anymore with saying, well, we're just going to give a little benefit to a certain racial group because of fill in the blank, because of diversity, equity, inclusion, systemic racism, the problem of your whiteness, your white supremacy. All those things, this efforts to cure societal discrimination are no excuse for explicit race discrimination. And it's really pernicious in our culture right now, the idea that belonging to a certain race makes you either better or worse. For example, in this case, Harvard said, quote, "A black student can usually bring something to the table that a white person cannot offer." Now, just think about that, like, for a minute. That because of your race, because you have a certain pigment, or your parents came from a certain country, therefore, automatically, we are assuming that you can bring something to the table that a white person, another stereotype, cannot bring to the table. And that sort of thing I say the court says it's illegal and unconstitutional, but I say it's immoral. And I think that we need to get back to the moral foundations of this country, which are that all men and women are created equal, they have equal rights, and that our country, although has had an imperfect history and has striven to uphold that and struggled over many years to have equality, we're now at a place in 2023 that we can actually do it. We can actually say, we're going to be colorblind and your race doesn't matter and it shouldn't matter.
Imagine if the situation were reversed. A university spoke out and said, white people bring something that non-white people don't. And they'd burn the buildings down. There would be protests there, and every single administrator at that university would be asked to resign. I mean, it's unbelievable to me that they don't see their own racism when they make statements like this.
Yes, and what we're doing with this equality for all agenda is we've identified between 40 and 50 state laws in Wisconsin or state policies that do discriminate based on race right now. Many of them are in the budget that was just passed. They're enshrined in our statutes. They've been around for decades. And we're asking the legislature to repeal the racial classifications that are involved in these. We're not actually asking them to get rid of these programs, but we're just asking them to open up these programs to all. For example, there are scholarships in Wisconsin. I think that's great. We should have scholarships. These scholarships are based on need. That's great. Needy kids need scholarships. But if you're white or you're from the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, Iran, if your parents are from Egypt, if your grandparents are from China or India, you can't get this scholarship just because of that, just because of what your race is or where your parents are from or where your grandparents. That's racism that needs to go. That's completely unjustified. There's no excuse for that. It's archaic. It's based on all sorts of racist stereotypes. We give loans to certain teachers. We want to help teachers who have just come out of college and have debt and need some startup cash in their career. That's great. But also, again, certain teachers are excluded because of their race. We can't have that in our state law. It needs to go. It needs to be opened up to everybody. Also, our state buys a lot of things. As you can imagine, if you are, say, you own a car dealership or a construction company, or you're a painter or you're a plumber, or you provide some sort of service, the state, a lot of these state departments, maybe the prisons or the Department of Transportation, they might want to hire you as a contractor, but there are 11 separate state programs that give special access to contractors and small business owners that are owned by people who are not white and not Asian. And that's in our state law. It's got to go. The way we even treat people who are suffering from alcohol and drug abuse in the state, the Department of Health Services has a special program just for, quote, Hispanics and Black Americans. You're out of luck if you have a drug abuse problem and you're not Hispanic or Black American, you're ineligible for this particular program. And there's no justification. There's no, study or science or anything that the state is saying, well, this is why we do it. Here's this really important reason. No, there is no important reason. And it's just really, really sad. And those are those 20 or so state laws that need to go right now. And in addition, we've got a number of things going on at the state agencies, including UW. UW is one of the big offenders.
Well, and I encourage you to, I don't really encourage this, but continue to describe these, because again, I'll ask the question, imagine if there were white-only scholarships and white-only perks or opportunities that the requirement was that you could only be a white person and receive these types of opportunities or scholarships, etc. The outcry would be unbelievable.
Yeah, and that's what the Supreme Court said, that the law needs to be the same for people, the same law for the Black person as the white person, is what the Supreme Court says. In other words, it shouldn't matter. It has to be colorblind. And the rule that we're asking for is what the Supreme Court says, a very simple rule. Just could be colorblind. Just pretend that the race doesn't matter. But we're seeing over and over, as I said, especially UW is a big violator. UW has a faculty diversity initiative, which was just called out in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago, that discriminates in hiring of new teachers. They say things like, we could really use someone with a Hispanic perspective to be in this particular department because that would add value to the department just because they're Hispanic. Well, that's a racial stereotype, and that That also means that someone who is non-Hispanic is not receiving that benefit, so that's a negative towards that person, which is also illegal. The UW also has segregated dorms. A lot of people don't know this. It's right on their website. They have dorms dedicated to African Americans, and they have a dorm dedicated to Native Americans. It's right on their website, segregated residence halls. 1968, some
Unbelievable.
people maybe remember after the death of Martin Luther King Jr. that one of the things Congress did is they passed the Fair Housing Act, which said that you can't discriminate in housing. Well, UW apparently says, that doesn't apply to them. So, the dorms get to be segregated. They have these things called BIPOC affirming spaces, which are special safe spaces, Meg, where you
Oh,
can go if you're a certain race, and it says on the website that if you are not one of the races, so let's say you're a white woman, you need to, quote, approach these spaces with care.
oh.
How demeaning and racist and arrogant, and how much bigotry is involved just in that little phrase there. But yeah, UW does the diversity internship program. UW Milwaukee, if you're a student there, you get access to a certain internship program, but not if you're a certain race. But the other agencies, Department of Workforce Development and DHS, they've got grant programs for certain racial groups. Department of Administration, and our technical colleges. The boards that govern them are governed with their racial quotas there. But a lot of this started at the state, actually, with Tony Evers, who demanded sort of right away. He signed an executive order that said that every agency at the state has to have an equity and inclusion plan. And a lot of agencies have just really run with this requirement, and they have imposed all sorts of racial quotas, hiring quotas. Department of Revenue, for example, says it needs to hire 5 auditors from, quote, diverse populations, because apparently your race determines whether you're a good auditor or not. And a lot of these agencies have hiring panels with quotas, so that, like, if they're going to hire you, you go sit before a committee with 5 people, and a certain number of the committee has to be a certain race, and then they have to ask you about diversity, equity, and inclusion. You have to say the right thing to get hired at the state. And so, they're really self-selecting. I think part of this is that, part of the political strategy, I would think, is that with a lot of these woke companies and governments, is like, we just want to get conservatives out. We don't want conservatives working here. And so one way to make sure conservatives are not going to work at a place is to load their hiring process with all sorts of DEI. And so you're gonna create these institutions, these government agencies that are just filled with liberals and progressives. And then, if you're the legislature and you're trying to rein these people in, you're just going to get resistance. So there's also a political, I think, strategy with all this DEI too, which is, we talk a lot about the deep state, and
Right.
we hear these people running for president like Ron DeSantis, and he says, like, one of the top 3 things he wants to do is to take care of. He says reconstitutionalize the government, meaning take away power from these state agencies and these government agencies and these bureaucrats, which are just basically running everything, and people's representatives don't have much of a say. So yeah, in addition to the moral and the legal aspect, there is also a political game here. It's a long game, but it's scary for people who believe in liberty and freedom, and people who want to be left alone, which I assume are most of your listeners. That's their political philosophy, I would guess, is they want to be left alone to run their business and have their family and go to church, and that's about the extent of their political philosophy, which is the American way, essentially.
And that it's under attack. Let's face it. So in your press release, which just came out yesterday, the president and general counsel of Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, Rick Essenberg, said the Constitution demands equal treatment for all. Today represents just the first step. Our work provides not only a model for Wisconsin, but for the entire country. So what are some of your plans to get these departments within and these agencies within our state government to comply?
Well, this plan we have is a plan primarily right now for the legislature, and Robin Voss actually tweeted support for taking a deep dive and looking at these in the fall session, and we, commend the speaker for his dedication to equality. And he's, he's a great believer in equality, and we hope that he takes these recommendations. And it would be great to have hearings. It would be great to bring in these agency heads and ask them, what do they mean by diversity, equity, inclusion? What specifically are they doing? What are they doing to our state employees? What are they doing to the people who are the recipients of state benefits? What are they doing as a service agency? I mean, what is DNR doing to the people who use DNR services, like our parks and our streams and our lakes and our walking paths? And what does DEI mean for that? And what are you doing to this state? And it would be nice to hear from our state agencies, and then to repeal or to open up these programs so that people can benefit from these programs regardless of their race. And then, the third prong is that to the extent people have been harmed from these programs, that they have been discriminated based on race, they can contact us and we'll evaluate their case. And we already have one lawsuit pending against the scholarships that are based on race, and I am certain there will be more litigation in the future. But it's much easier, obviously, to fix these things through legislation and for the people's representatives to go to Madison and vote on new laws that make our laws colorblind and equal and fair for everyone.
And it's interesting, Dan, because there's a poll conducted July 1st through the 5th for The Economist, and they surveyed 1,500 adults, and more Black Americans, more Hispanic Americans support the Supreme Court's affirmative action ruling than oppose it. So, I mean, I would think that those who are non-whites that are told that, well, there's no other way that you're going to achieve this or that you're going to accomplish this unless we give you some sort of special privileges. I would think that would be offensive to someone who knows their own abilities and knows that their own potential and would strive to be the best version of themselves as opposed to getting a handout. And I think it truly is offensive. And I've always said this about affirmative action. It's really offensive to people, everyone in general, that's told that they can't achieve something unless they're given some sort of special privileges or special dispensation. It really I think it's such a it's a monumental change in our country, and I really do look forward to what Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty leading the charge, not only here in Wisconsin but throughout the country, as Rick Essenberg said, providing a model for the rest of the country. Anything else you want to add before I let you go?
No, that's it. Thank you for having me, Meg.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. Anybody who has questions, they can go to will-law.org and they can look at our reports. Or if they need a lawyer, they can hit the button that says "Contact Us," and one of our lawyers, we review all of the requests that come in. So if you need someone to look at your case, if the government's taken away your liberty or your freedoms, we would be happy to hear from you.
Yeah, particularly government employees, if you want to contact. And you read my mind. I actually had that written down. How does Will take on a case? And I can't stress that enough. I get questions from listeners all the time about that, and the best way to get the attention of the attorneys at Will, again, is to go to will-law.org. And then, as Dan said, click on the button. What's the button say again?
Contact a lawyer.
Yes, and then you fill out an online form, if I'm not mistaken, and then all in detail describes your situation. Well, Dan Lennington, thank you so much for joining me this morning. I appreciate it very much.
You're welcome. Have a great day.
Thanks, you too.